She entered his life not with noise, but with grace, like a poem that had been written long before time itself began, waiting only for the right moment to be read. Sheikh Hamdan, the poet the world called Fazza, had written about beauty, loyalty, and love countless times, yet nothing could have prepared him for her. She was not just a muse, she was meaning itself. Every glance of hers felt like a verse, every word she spoke an unfinished stanza. She wasn't the kind of woman to be owned, she was the kind to be remembered, and he knew, even in the beginning, that his heart was in danger. Their story was written in silence, carried by the winds of Dubai's golden nights. The world saw him as the prince of poetry, the man of vision and valor, but she saw what no one else could, the vulnerability behind his words. She read his pauses more than his poems, and she loved the man, not the legend. Yet fate, cruel and untamed, had other plans. What began as a secret symphony turned into a forbidden masterpiece. He wrote her endlessly, yet every poem that carried her soul was one the world would never see. She had become his confession, his prayer, his truth. Every letter of her name found its way into his verses, disguised beneath metaphors too delicate to decode. The ink on his page knew her laughter, the spaces between his lines knew her silence. She was the rhythm his heart could no longer live without. But while his pen ached to immortalize her, his crown forbade it. Some love stories are too sacred for the public eye, and theirs was one the world was never meant to touch. There were nights when he sat beneath the moon, the same moon that once watched her smile, and wrote until his hands trembled. He would whisper her name like a vow, knowing the paper would keep it safe when he could not. But as much as he wanted the world to know her, to understand the power she held over his spirit, he also feared what it would take from them if he did. He couldn't let the world soil something so divine. And so, he turned their love into a secret art, hiding her within metaphors only his heart could read. Every poet dreams of creating a masterpiece, but for him, she was the masterpiece. The irony was cruel. He could paint the world with words, but he could never paint her. The more he tried to write her truth, the more he realized that some stories cannot survive exposure. To love her meant to protect her from the world that adored him. So he smiled for the cameras, while his soul bled in silence. His followers read his poetry and called it beautiful, never knowing that behind each line was a love too pure for the light. She would tell him sometimes, with that calm voice that could disarm any storm, "You don't have to write me." But how could he not? To him, she wasn't just a woman, she was existence itself, wrapped in tenderness and truth. Every sunrise reminded him of her, every gust of wind carried her scent. Yet he kept her hidden, not out of shame, but out of reverence. Because some poems are too honest for the world, they can only live in the heart that felt them. When she left, she didn't take his love with her, she became it. Her absence filled his pages more than her presence ever could. He stopped writing for months, afraid of what his ink might reveal. The palace walls began to echo differently. Even the desert seemed quieter without her spirit moving through his world. And yet, whenever he closed his eyes, she was still there, not as a memory, but as a language. She was no longer a person he loved, she had become the poetry he breathed. He would read his old verses sometimes and smile bitterly. The public thought they knew the stories, the beauty, the ache, the wonder, but they didn't. They saw the gold, not the bleeding. They saw the rhyme, not the reason. What he truly felt for her could never be printed, because it wasn't written in words, it was written in moments, in glances, in the spaces between two souls who met too deeply, too impossibly, to belong to this world. There were rumors, of course. The world always wonders about the poet's muse. They guessed, speculated, imagined, but none could ever know. She wasn't a name, she was a heartbeat. And even if he could tell them, he wouldn't. Because once a secret love is spoken aloud, it loses its divinity. He kept her safe in the one place no one could reach, inside his art, between the lines, where her spirit would live forever.
There were nights when the weight of her silence pressed harder than the crown on his head. He would sit beneath the same moon that once shone over their stolen moments and wonder if she, too, looked up at it, if she, too, felt that invisible thread that still tied them across distance and destiny. He had written her 1,000 times, yet he could never bring himself to let a single one of those poems escape his heart. To publish them would be to expose a sacred wound, and he had promised her, even in her absence, that some things must remain untouched by fame. He often dreamed of her standing in the distance, dressed in white, her eyes holding the same quiet fire that once undid his composure. In the dream, she would smile and say, "You never needed to write me, Hamdan. I was already written in you." And then she would fade, leaving him breathless, clutching at air that still smelled of poetry. When he awoke, he would reach for his pen, not to immortalize her, but to keep her close, because each line he wrote was not a poem, but a heartbeat trying to remember its rhythm. The world saw his verses as romantic, timeless, divine. They never realized they were fragments of a soul trying to hold on to the impossible. His words were his confession, but his silence was his loyalty. For every poem he shared with the world, there were 10 he burned before dawn, verses too honest, too alive, too filled with her to ever belong to anyone else. She was his truth, and the truth, he had learned, was not meant for the crowd. In the stillness of the desert, he often found her again. The sand shimmered with the same softness as her touch, and the wind whispered in the tone of her laughter. The desert did not ask questions, it simply remembered. And in its endless expanse, he realized something: maybe she was never meant to be a chapter in his story. Maybe she was the ink itself, the pulse that gave meaning to his every word. The poem he couldn't publish wasn't hidden on paper, it was written into his being. Years turned, and the world changed, but the ache did not. He grew wiser, quieter, more mysterious. People called it depth, but it was really devotion. Every award, every poem, every applause felt hollow without her gaze to meet it. He wondered if she ever read his lines from afar, if she recognized herself hidden in metaphors that only she could decode. Perhaps she did. Perhaps that was enough. Love, after all, doesn't need recognition, it only needs remembrance. Sometimes he would ride through the early dawn, where the city's edge met the emptiness of the desert, and recite